Talking with Bill Tieleman, local journalist, about the Basi-Virk BC Rail case. And oops, I made a major error. I was so excited starting the program that instead of saying December 28th, 2003, I said January 28th. My mistake, mea culpa. The date is January 28th, 2003. Now, talk show hosts make mistakes, but the quote of the century, not of the year, the quote of the century comes from George Abbott, who's one of the liberal hopefuls, and he says, I don't think governments make mistakes. Governments make decisions, and then they learn to do things better. I don't make mistakes.
Yeah.
Now, what was the matching quote?
Well, Dave Zernheld, the NDP minister at the time, said government can do anything.
Government can do
anything. So that's
anything.
good. So you put those two bookends together. Government can do anything, and they don't make mistakes. And it's a happy, perfect world.
It's a perfect world. Yeah, yeah. Thank goodness I still have my rose-colored glasses on. Okay, let's talk about the way any of this has then been handled. So these two guys, Basi and Virk, are charged with breach of trust and
fraud.
A couple of good charges. And we're just about to hear testimony from Gary Collins.
That's correct.
Gary Collins, who was the finance minister and then went to private business, worked for an airline that went defunct after a while and has done other things since then, and other interesting witnesses. And suddenly, just when, October? October, Basi and Virk changed their minds, and instead of pleading not guilty and fighting the case, they suddenly plead guilty. But miracle upon miracles, you and I, the taxpayer, spend $6 million to cover their court costs. How did that happen?
Wouldn't you like to know?
Yes, I would. Well, why don't I? Why don't I know?
The movie was 3/4 through the reel, and all of a sudden it stopped.
Yes.
Look, these guys and their lawyers, and they give their defense lawyers, who are very senior veteran lawyers, full credit. They've been fighting this thing on for 6 years, 7 years, going on. Incredible long pretrial hearings, a Supreme Court of Canada hearing, all these sort of things. They went, obviously, to the Crown and said, look, we'll plead guilty, but we've got to be made whole. We've got to be paid all of the fees for all these years, and it's going to be $6 million. That went into the government, and there's rumors of different deals and plea bargains that went on during that period of time when there was negotiations going on. Ultimately, the government signed off, the BC provincial government signed off on paying $6 million in legal fees, and also that the charges would be agreed to 2 years less a day house arrest. So, you could have spent 5 years in the pen.
Now all of that might be fine. It isn't, but it might be fine if the government, as you refer to them, were something we could put our fingers on or point to. Who is the government exactly? In this case, the man who stick-handled this deal, this mysterious deal, apparently was Mike de Jong.
That's correct.
Who was
Attorney General.
The Attorney General. Except that when he was asked publicly several times about how he stick-handled this deal, he kept changing his story.
He seemed to make a lot of mistakes for someone who's dealing with a very major public and extremely controversial issue. And we've heard stories, from the caucus meetings that the caucus wasn't too happy either. The Liberal caucus was some of the way this was dealt with. But the bottom line, David, is this. Where do you get guys? The idea there's an indemnification. You're working for the government. Joe or Jane Citizen charges you or claims you did something wrong. The government will defend you, as it should, unless you're found guilty.
Yes.
Unless you're found guilty. They were both found guilty. And they both got not $100,000 in legal fees, not $200,000, $6 million in legal fees.
And they were looking at $3 million each.
Correct.
Right. And who knows if they had the capability to pay that.
Well, they didn't. I mean, they clearly didn't. But they could have forfeited their houses. They could have had their wages garnished. They could have had long-term debts imposed. I mean, even if you recovered part of it, clearly there's an interest in that. Now, to be fair to Mr. de Jong and the government, they said, look, we're not going to recover all the money. It's going to cost us as much to do it. And if the trial continued for another 2 years or year and a half, whatever it was scheduled for, who knows how long it would have gone, it's going to cost a lot more money. And what would the result be? Either they were guilty again, and so we have the same conclusion, or they're not guilty and we don't get any of the money back.
Well, I've labeled this the phantom deal. It's the deal that never happened. It's the deal that nobody can explain. Finally, after a lot of shuffling of the deck chairs on this Titanic, what we get is that, you help me, two guys, one was the deputy minister of something and one was the deputy minister of something else. These guys apparently were the guys who made this decision.
Yes, and it obviously had to be authorized by Mr. de Jong at some level. He had to sign off on their decision.
Okay, well, how did two deputy ministers come to make a decision this momentous?
Well, it's the criminal justice branch area. I mean, it is, you know, there's an indemnification process. It was the same thing that happened with Glenn Clark when he was charged and vindicated and found not guilty as well, and his legal fees recovered. But it's never happened that someone who was found guilty was paid for their legal fees.
But
only the innocent.
But the only premier that I know of in the last 40 years in BC history who wasn't an autocratic premier was thrown out of office by his own people. That's Mike Harcourt. Every other premier, Gordon Campbell, Glenn Clark, and so on, ruled with an iron fist, and they knew everything that went on, and nobody did anything without their approval. So for me, it's hard for me to believe, and I think many people sitting around coffee shops and beer parlors, to believe that two deputy premiers reached a decision, deputy ministers reached a decision so momentous as this, as to pay $6 million in legal fees for two petty felons without somebody who likes to rule the ship really knowing.
You're an awfully suspicious gentleman,
Aren't
I have to say.
Aren't I
it's
cynical?
Just terrible.
Yeah.
It's just terrible. Well, the reality is that this deal stopped the testimony of 2 to 3 dozen top insiders, including Gary Collins, including possibly Christy Clark. We don't know all the witnesses, including possibly Premier Campbell himself, including Patrick Kinsella. There's a long list of people we know and others we believe could have been called by the defense as witnesses as well. It stopped it right there, just dead. That's it. It's over. And the cost of ending the trial was $6 million in legal fees, plus the other $12 million in the investigation costs. That's sort of the estimate. So $18 million. But we're told that we can't afford a public inquiry.
What have we heard from the RCMP since all of this has happened? Are the RCMP just shaking their heads and saying, what did we do all this for? Or are they saying, well, that was a waste of time?
I know. I think they're saying the guilty parties pled guilty eventually, and that's what you're looking for as a result, and give us back the evidence.
And they're going to hold on to it for a while.
That's what they say.
Okay. So what does the future hold for those of us who are endlessly curious? And I'd like to suggest that most British Columbians are. I don't think... Oh. I don't think many British Columbians are satisfied that we've heard the end of this story or that we really know what happened. So what's the possible future?
Well, David, many people said to me, you've been following this for 6, 7 years. People are just tired as they're not interested. But then there was a poll by Ipsos or Angus Reid saying 76% of people did want to know about BC Rail and what happened in Basi-Virk. And as I said, it's $1 billion sale. It's not something minor. The reality is that all the Liberal leadership candidates, with the slight exception of George Abbott, have said they would not support a public inquiry. George Abbott said he'd look at the legal indemnification issue, but that only, not the sale of BC Rail. And the NDP has said that they would hold a public inquiry. So I guess the results will depend on the next election, which I expect this year. Yeah, but a public inquiry, I mean, public inquiries often can make for a few good television bites, but they don't very often bring a lot of hearty results. I mean, Wally Opal's holding a public inquiry about the missing women, and how many people believe we're going to learn anything new there? But I think Thomas Braidwood and the Jacansky inquiry on the tasering at the airport was a remarkably good public inquiry, and it has made many positive changes to the way that people are dealt with at the airport, and security and RCMP and taser, all of those things as a result of public inquiry. So there have been some very positive public inquiries in our history. So if you had your druthers, if you were at a political rally, would you ask each of those candidates that Mason and I discussed last week to make a statement about whether or not they favor some inquiry? I think they should, and I think if they were involved in a decision to sell BC Rail after they all promised collectively, who were in that government of that period, which I think all of them but Moira Stillwell and Mr. Main were, why they sold BC Rail. I mean, like, this is still an issue. They should ask people should ask the question. Liberals, good liberals, should ask the question, and they shouldn't be afraid of the answer. If they've got a good answer, let's hear it. But can a public inquiry call on such prominent people as, yes? Oh, yes. The public inquiry with a judge in charge can call anybody. If the retired... They could call you and I. Well, that's different. if they, we just wouldn't go. But if the former premier is called, if Mr. Kinsella is called, and so on and so on, they would be required by law to show up? That's correct. Well, let's do it. I'm in favor. Let's find out. I've got a Facebook group saying just that. If people can join. Now, Bill, this is a dangerous subject to discuss publicly, and you've written about it on your blog and elsewhere for about 8 years. Nobody sued you. No. Why not? I'm accurate. I report what I hear in court. I make clear that these are allegations, defense allegations. Like most of this was pretrial hearings. Those were defense allegations, and they often were reading from documents that were evidence, which they said, very noted lawyers with a lot of respect, Mike Bolton, Kevin McCullough, they said were from different pieces of evidence, but it was not proven in court. It wasn't subject to cross-examination by the Crown. However, and they are allegations, but we have a protected right in the society to report what's heard in open court, unless there's a publication ban. And that's what we've done. So that's what I've done. I haven't, anytime someone's complained to me, and it's been very rare, that there was some sort of error in my reporting, I've corrected it immediately, and I have no problem doing that. But I've never been threatened with a lawsuit.
You mean you make mistakes?
Occasionally.
It's only the government that doesn't make mistakes.
No, the government doesn't make mistakes.
Yeah. Look, you mentioned in the first half of this program, some folks at CN said we're paying Mr. Kinsella sizable fees, and we're not quite sure what he's doing for us.
BC Rail.
Sorry, BC Rail. What's he doing for this fee? Are there documents about that? Did anybody ask? I mean, are there statements from these companies saying, well, here's what he did?
I presume there are invoices and other things, but we didn't get to that portion of the trial where we might have seen that entered as evidence. All of those million pages or more of evidence, some of that would have been entered into the public record, and you and I could have a stack of it sitting here if we'd had the full trial. But when the trial ended, the evidence goes off the table.
So somebody bought the silence of these two felons is the sort of general headline grabber of a statement.
It's certainly a headline grabber, yes.
Yeah, but nobody's prepared to say who, and certainly nobody can prove any of that so far.
The argument is that from the government, as I said, that they paid $6 million because it was cheaper to end the trial with a guilty plea from the two guilty members than it was to continue it and see what happened and cost more money and possibly have the same result. That's the government position. But Bill, it's up to people to decide on that one.
But Bill, that's discouraging because it's cheaper in terms of cash, but is it cheaper in terms of decency and honor and some sense of being good governors?
Well, you have to look at the other side of it. If you're David Basi and Bob Virk and you've been charged for 7 years and you can't work, really, had very little work, supported by their families and other things, and you're looking at the prospect of another year of trial, no idea whether you're going to be found guilty or not, and if you're found guilty, you're going to have to pay back $6, $7 million, $8 million in legal fees, and somebody says, hey, here's the offer, 2 years less a day, house arrest, and you don't pay any legal fees. You keep your house. That's a lot of pressure, and it's a lot, you know, most of us gamble all our lives, but we don't gamble with our family's houses, we don't gamble with our future. And they were forced to gamble, and whether they made a good gamble or not, whether they're guilty or not, if they're guilty, they should be punished. I've always said that. But they had to gamble.
Yeah, will you think very little of me if I don't have a lot of sympathy for them?
I don't know, not at all.
Okay, Bill Tieleman, thank you very much. It's been terrific.
Thanks, David.
I hope we hear more about the Basi-Virk story. Some of us would like to know what really went on. Look, next week, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have Justice Wallace Craig with us. He's a real maverick retired judge, and he's going to give us his inventory on how we're doing in the Lower Mainland in terms of crime and punishment. It'll be a doozer. So be with us for that. Thanks very much for being with us on this program. Terrific, Bill.
Great.